Hello, today we're going to talk about Russia's horoscope. Yes, I'm aware that this country has many horoscopes that can be used. Some astrologers rely on charts that were created at the time of Rurik's arrival in ancient Rus. There are people who prioritize the time of Peter the Great. Why? Because he was the first emperor of Russia, and starting from certain moments during his reign, for example, the moment of his coronation, you can count the horoscopes of the Russian Empire. There are people who rely on horoscopes associated with the Soviet Union, and these are indeed very useful, interesting horoscopes. But my forecast is based on the horoscope from June 12th, 1990, which I know more or less well from past events and the events happening now. But before I start a detailed forecast for the near future, most likely for the next 10 to 15 years, I'll pause on this point. I analyzed Pluto's movement over the last 400 years in the context of its influence on Russia. I found that at moments of maximum declination, both north and south, in Russia, or in the state formation that existed at that time, key changes were possible. I'll name three previous rulers whose reign coincided with the moments of Pluto's maximum declination: Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Joseph Stalin, and the last fourth period begins in 2020 and will last approximately until 2036 to 38. And as we can see, the beginning of this reign falls during Vladimir Putin's period. Therefore, all these four names stand in the same line in terms of Pluto's movement. Of these four periods, the greatest similarity is between the period of Peter the Great and Joseph Stalin, as well as the period of Catherine the Great and Vladimir Putin. Briefly, let me remind you who Catherine the Great was and her influence on Russia. She held power for almost 35 years. During her reign, a successful reform of the provinces was carried out. She divided the country into new administrative territorial units, strengthened central authority, abolished the Zaporozhian Siege, expanded Russia's holdings near the Black Sea, conducted successful wars against Turkey, against Poland, and accordingly expanded Russia's holdings in Poland. Part of Belarus, part of right bank Ukraine went to Russia, and naturally territories near the Black Sea, this is Novorossiya, this is Crimea, were also included in Russia during Catherine the Great's time. In addition, Catherine the Great had a great influence on the flourishing of Russian culture because she supported science, literature, education, and art. The practice of inviting foreign specialists, luminaries in science and art to Russia was used. Thus, Catherine the Great had a generally positive influence on the Russian Empire. By the end of her reign, the country was in a completely different state than at the beginning of her reign. Vladimir Putin is likely to have similar tasks. It can be said with great confidence that from 2020 to 2036, significant reforms will be carried out in Russia, which will concern the country's governance. This country may even change its form of government. Nevertheless, the overall outcome of such Plutonian periods for Russia has always been positive. Now I will move on to a more detailed forecast. This is roughly what Russia's horoscope looks like from June 12, 1990. Virgo is likely rising. We see the Sun in Gemini, the Moon in Aquarius, and a strong Jupiter in the 10th house. So in the near future, in 2025, this influence has already begun to be felt and will continue in 2026. The greatest influence is the zodiacal direction of Pluto and Venus. As we see in the horoscope, they are strictly connected by opposition, very precisely by opposition. Therefore, the simultaneous directional movement of these planets will be activated almost simultaneously. But there is one nuance. Pluto will reach the position to the Sun slightly earlier, and immediately after this, Venus will make its conjunction with the Sun. The opposition of Pluto to the Sun, considering that Pluto is in Scorpio in the second house, is likely to relate to economic processes, to a possible economic crisis in Russia. In addition, this Pluto may relate to the finances that are currently, as I read this horoscope on September 1st, 2025, frozen in Western banks. It is possible that the old dream of some Europeans may come true and they will manage to unfreeze these funds in their favor. Naturally, this will cause some crisis. Moreover, this same Pluto may indicate unfavorable economic processes that may be initiated at the end of 2025 and will be relevant, especially relevant in February and early March 2026. This period, in my opinion, is tense, unfavorable for Russia, primarily from an economic point of view. Another interpretation of Pluto's position to the Sun, considering that the Sun symbolizes authority, the ruler. Pluto may indicate a conspiracy from people associated with special services, organized crime, but I give this option less influence. By the way, a similar aspect was in the past, not long ago in 2023. In that case, the directional sun stood exactly opposite Saturn, and this time fell in June 2023. It was precisely the time when Yevgeny Prigozhin organized his rebellion, the March on Moscow. I believe that this was indeed a serious event. It was not spontaneous, and as some experts now point out, they found traces of preparation by special people on the eve of this supposedly spontaneous event. It was a real rebellion. Well, let's return to 2026. Until about mid-March 2026, the tense influence of Pluto will be felt, which may also manifest in currency fluctuations, the ruble, Russian stocks. But then Venus will increasingly come into play, which will conjunct the Sun in Russia's horoscope. April, May, June. To this aspect is added a favorable sextile from Jupiter. That is why the forecast related to peace for Ukraine I associate precisely with the period of April, May, June 2026. The most favorable aspects in Russia's horoscope, moreover, Venus will emphasize its influence, and Venus is associated with peace. The residual favorable influences from this event will last almost half a year. That is, almost until the end of 2026. I see a favorable influence for Russia, growth, and the reputation of this country. Possibly from May to November 2026, a significant part of the political, cultural, economic sanctions on Russia will be lifted. If we move our directions further, it will be found that around 2027 to 28, tense aspects will again come into play. A recurrence of past events is possible. Some repeated military actions on the same territory where peace was recently concluded, or the emergence of new hotspots of tension in the Baltics or Central Asia in the Caucasus. These details will need to be considered in detail in a separate forecast for 2027 to 28. In 2029, in 2030, favorable energies in Russia's horoscope will be revived again. Conflicts that may flare up in 2027 to 28 will be extinguished. 2027, by the way, is specially marked in the chart as the so-called air epochs. Thus, for the world, 2027 in general, for the world, it looks, in my opinion, the most important. The period 2030 to 35 for Russia I see as a period of completion of state restructuring, adjustments in the economy. These years, in my opinion, look more or less neutral for this country. By 2035, the state structure of Russia should already be settled in a new format, and Russia itself may enter a new type of military or political alliances that will determine the situation in the world for many decades to come. Perhaps 2035 can be called the year of establishing a new world order, which many people talk about, investing something of their own in this world. I think this small forecast can be limited to 2035. Looking 10 years ahead in Russia's horoscope is already a lot. I can tell you that analyzing Israel's horoscopes, for example, was much easier for me than Russia's horoscope. With Russia's horoscope, there are many more pitfalls and surprises. Goodbye, all the best.